All right, the recording is now in progress. Well, I must say it's a real pleasure to be with you today. Although we can't see you, hopefully you can see and hear us. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and kick things off today. Can everyone see my screen?
No.
Oh dear. Okay, let me try again. I will try one more time.
You can't see my
Please share
screen.
screen. How about now?
Yep. There
Yeah.
we go.
Okay, perfect. I just want to keep you on your toes. Well, again, it's a real pleasure to be with you today. I'm going to just go ahead and jump right in if that's okay. Start with introductions, of course. And thanks kindly for Rachel for introducing us and for the invitation. My name is Josh Mersky. I'm a professor of social work at UW-Milwaukee, and I'm co-director of the Institute for Child and Family Wellbeing, which is a community university partnership between our Helen Bader School of Social Welfare and Children's Wisconsin. I have the great pleasure of being joined today by Dr. Dimitri Topitzes, longtime friend and colleague who is also a professor in our department, clinical services director in our institute, and he's also the chair of our program. Dimitri and I have been working for a long time in this space related to trauma and trauma-informed care. So we're really looking forward to sharing briefly some of the lessons that we've learned over the last 20 some years or so doing work in this area. You know, as we alluded to already, it's going to be a brief presentation. Here's the basic agenda. We're going to be exploring definitions, types, and of trauma, as well as the prevalence of trauma. Dimitri is going to be talking about some of the consequences of trauma and then translating what we know about trauma into sort of implications for what we can do about it, looking through the lens of both trauma-informed and trauma-responsive work. And as Rachel suggested, we really would like to carve out some time to hear from you, some of your questions. So hopefully there'll be sufficient time to have a dialogue at the end. Last piece of housekeeping, if you have any questions, burning questions as we go, if anything's not clear, please don't hesitate to interrupt us. Always happy to take questions. All right, so it's my job to try to convince you at the beginning that this is an important topic, that you should actually care about the issue of trauma. I'm going to do my best to convince you if you're not already. I'm going to come at this from 5 different perspectives. So if we wanted to ask the question, why does trauma matter? I think you could answer it in many different ways. Here are 5 different ways. Number 1, trauma is important because it's a public health issue. It's a critical public health issue because trauma is widespread in society. In other words, many, if not most people are exposed to trauma at some point in their lives. In addition, it's highly consequential. Trauma is linked to some of the most significant life course outcomes that we can think of. And Dimitri will be talking at length about some of those consequences later on. So it's a key public health issue. Secondly, it's a social justice issue. Trauma is not only widespread, it's not only widely distributed in society, it's unequally distributed in society. So while I may be at risk of trauma myself, people who are more, say, economically disadvantaged than I am are at an even greater risk of trauma, right? So trauma is disproportionately distributed in society, and people who are disadvantaged or marginalized are more likely to be exposed than others. Thirdly, I think you can argue that it's an economic issue. We know that trauma is not only linked to significant personal suffering, it's also linked to significant public costs. For example, it's been estimated conservatively that child abuse and neglect alone is associated with over $500 billion of lifetime costs to society. And that's just child abuse and neglect. We'll be talking about many other forms of trauma today that individuals are exposed to. right? So it's not just a personal issue. We all have a stake in this because it has significant economic cost to society. Fourth, it's a key human rights issue. For example, so everyone has the right to safety, security, and freedom from trauma. Back in 1948, in fact, the United Nations issued a Declaration of Human Rights. And there are very specific articles, Article 3 and Article 5, that stipulate that human beings have the right to certain freedoms, freedoms from torture, freedoms from slavery, freedoms from degrading treatment, etc. So you can come at this even from a basic human rights issue, that we have the right to be free from trauma. It's not only a human rights issue, but lastly, it's also a human service issue. It's something that we can do something about. As human service providers ourselves, Dimitri and I are both social workers. We take this obligation very seriously. And I assume that the audience that I'm speaking with today is composed of people that either work directly with individuals and families or work on their behalf. And so I bring this up because we have an obligation, I think, and the ability to do something about this issue. In other words, trauma is something that is an alterable condition. It's not a fundamental necessary condition of our existence. And if we pull together and offer high quality services to individuals and families that reduce stressors in the home, and that we have the potential to prevent trauma from occurring in the first place, and we have the potential to mitigate its effects. So moving on, let's talk a little bit about what trauma is. Trauma is actually a term that we're all familiar with, and yet it's a somewhat nebulous concept. It's not a concept that's really easy to define. One of the reasons is that trauma involves both a cause and an effect, and the cause and the effect are intertwined. When we say that someone has trauma or someone's experienced trauma, we can't know that someone has experienced trauma unless we know both what they experienced as well as the effects of those experiences. Now, as a researcher, I'm often in the business of trying to determine cause and effect. I like to separate cause and effect. But with trauma, you can't really know the cause without also knowing the effect. So we define trauma based in part on the fact that the experience is itself harmful. So that's a little bit convoluted in and of itself. Another thing that's complicated is that trauma isn't just one thing. It's many things. It has many different manifestations. It comes in many shapes and sizes, and we'll be talking about some of those different manifestations today. And lastly, it's difficult to define because definitions rely on standards, right? When we try to define something, we try to come up with language and rules that are the same for everyone. We try to come up with objective standards. And yet trauma is at least partly a subjective experience. What makes something traumatic for me may be a little bit different than what makes something traumatic for Dimitri. And so this just makes trauma a really complex phenomenon, but it also makes it really interesting for nerds like me to think about, talk about, and write about. I am going to offer some definitions for you to consider, ways of defining and looking at this concept of trauma. Here I'm pulling from the DSM-5, the American Psychiatric Association's definition of trauma that they have when it comes to diagnosing PTSD, or post-traumatic stress disorder. So I'm sure you all are somewhat familiar with PTSD. This is obviously a major trauma and stressor-related disorder. And a lot of what we know about trauma originated from both observations of, say, war veterans with PTSD and then research on PTSD. So since the PTSD was introduced in 1980, the APA has come to define trauma in certain ways, and that definition has evolved over time. Here's the most recent set of criteria for how they define it. Number one, trauma can involve death, serious physical injury, or sexual violence. So when clinicians, say, psychiatrists or psychologists look at this issue, they're often looking for very severe kinds of events. But as the definition has evolved, the APA has started to take in broader kinds of experiences, not just these really severe kinds of events like exposure to war or sexual violence, but trauma can also be things that don't just happen to us directly. It can also be things that happen to us indirectly. For example, trauma is now recognized as something that we not only experience, but it could be something that we witness, something that we observe. So, for example, a child who is exposed to domestic violence in their home, that can be defined as traumatic. Similarly, it's been expanded to recognize that people who work with and on behalf of traumatized populations can, simply by virtue of their work, they can also be exposed to trauma, what's sometimes referred to as secondary trauma. So, it would be, for example, first responders, like you think of folks who responded to the 9/11 crisis, right? They were exposed to high levels of trauma, and as a result of not just the physical trauma they experienced, but also the psychological trauma, many of those individuals ended up developing PTSD and other kinds of harmful psychological symptoms. Now, as the field has evolved, there's also been a recognition that trauma can be linked to more than just PTSD. While PTSD is a very important set of symptoms, trauma has far-reaching implications. And there are many different ways, again, that trauma can manifest, many different ways that we can experience trauma that can then lead to different kinds of post-traumatic sequelae or consequences. So there's this more recent kind of framework that's referred to as complex trauma that recognizes that many individuals are exposed to certain kinds of environments that are far more complex in nature. So when we talk about complex trauma, we're referring to severe stressors that are, number one, interpersonal in nature. In other words, that happen within the context of a human relationship. We now know that when trauma occurs within the context of a relationship, those experiences are often particularly salient. They have a certain meaning, for example, that getting in a car crash simply doesn't have. So there's something salient about when somebody does something to you personally that's harmful that we need to take into consideration. Secondly, complex trauma often involves severe stressors that are repetitive and prolonged. We know from good research that when you are exposed to trauma over long periods of time, over and over and over again, that your outcomes will tend to be worse overall than if you're exposed to a single event, a single acute event, right? So we have to pay attention to how long the exposure is, and so not just severity, but duration. Thirdly, complex trauma tends to occur at developmentally vulnerable times. In other words, the timing in your life course when you're exposed to trauma matters. There's some decent evidence to suggest, for example, that all other things being equal, if you're exposed to severe prolonged trauma really early in the life course, that tends to have pretty significant implications and long-lasting implications for your life course trajectories. And lastly, when we think about complex trauma, we're thinking about the kinds of traumatic experiences that tend to have persistent and pervasive effects over the life course. In other words, if you're exposed to repetitive, prolonged trauma that's interpersonal in nature, and if that happens really early in the life course, that often has long-term effects for you that can last a lifetime, and those effects can be seen across many different domains of development. So in addition to things like PTSD and other kinds of mental health symptoms, trauma gets linked to all kinds of harmful effects. It hinders economic and educational attainment. It compromises one's sense of self, one's perceptions of others, in other words, one's core identity. So anyway, that's sort of a brief overview of complex trauma, and that leads me to what I tend to prefer as sort of an integrated definition of trauma that I think there's no one perfect definition, but this one for me is about as close as I can get. So according to the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, trauma results from an event, a series of events, or a set of circumstances that is experienced by an individual as physically or emotionally harmful or threatening, and that has lasting adverse effects on the individual's functioning and physical, social, emotional, or spiritual well-being. So in other words, trauma isn't just one thing, it's many things. It's not just an event. It could be a series of prolonged events or even just a set of circumstances, the conditions that you live in, the water in which you swim, if you will. It's associated with a lot of different harmful effects. To define something as traumatic, we want those effects typically to be long lasting. In other words, we don't want to define something as traumatic just temporarily upsets me. We define things as traumatic when the effects are long lasting. And those effects, again, can have an impact across all aspects, holistic impacts on your overall well-being. So now, before I turn it over to Dimitri, I do want to talk a little bit about the prevalence of trauma. Just how common is it in our society? Well, as you might suspect, as I said earlier, it's really widespread. I'm just going to illustrate a couple of data points here to make the case. So thinking about child abuse and neglect alone, in 2021, there were approximately 3 million children in the United States who were the subject of a Child Protective Services investigation. 600,000 of those children were confirmed as victims. They had a substantiated report of abuse and neglect. And more than 1,800 children died directly as a result of being abused and neglected. And that's a lot of trauma, right? But here we're only talking about abuse and neglect as one form of trauma, and we're only talking about those children who come to the attention of Child Protective Services. If we broaden our lens a little further and we talked about adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs, some of you all may have heard of ACEs before. ACEs refer to not only events like child abuse and neglect, but it also can refer to other harmful household experiences like exposure to domestic violence, or having a caregiver who abused substances, or having a parent or caregiver who was incarcerated. If we broaden our lens out like that, surveys show consistently that more than 60% of American adults report that they have endured at least one adverse childhood experience. There's a lot of trauma in society. That illustrates it aptly, I think, in general. Now I want to get I want to return to a previous point I made, which is that trauma is also a social justice issue. In other words, trauma is not equally distributed in society. Here I want to show you just some Wisconsin data, some local data from a study that we launched, nearly a decade ago. It's called the Families and Children Thriving Study. This is a longitudinal study of risk and resilience among low-income families in Wisconsin who receive perinatal home visiting services. So these kinds of services are often delivered to pregnant women or families with young children with the goal of promoting positive health outcomes, child development outcomes, and positive parenting practices. So I want to now show you the levels of ACEs, the rates of ACEs that we found in this study of predominantly low-income women. This table shows you some of the percentages. These, again, are women who are low income. We found that the women in this study, in the FACT study, that 40% of them reported that they had been physically abused as a child. More than half reported that they grew up in a household where one of their caregivers abused substances. Well over a third grew up in a household where one of their parents had been incarcerated or in jail. Now you add all of those up, 85% of the women in our sample reported at least one ACE, and more than 2/3 reported 2 or more ACEs. These rates far exceed what you'll find in the general population. Now, to make matters worse, trauma, one of the particularly pernicious things about trauma is that it tends to autocorrelate. And by that, I mean trauma begets trauma. When you are exposed to trauma at one point in the life course, that increases your risk of later life exposure, particularly if you don't receive any kind of services or any kind of remediation. Here, I just wanted to show you some adverse adult experiences that this same sample reported that they were exposed to after the age of 18. In this sample of low-income women, more than half reported they had been physically or emotionally abused by a partner or spouse. Over half had had a partner or spouse who had been incarcerated or in jail. Well over a third reported they had been homeless at some point since turning age 18. The average age, by the way, of the women in this sample when they reported these potentially traumatic experiences was 27. And that means potentially that these are conservative estimates. As these women get older, they may well be exposed to other kinds of harmful events, and these rates may go up even further. In aggregate, 86% reported at least one adverse adult experience. More than 70% reported multiple adverse experiences. Now, the last thing I wanted to say, again, thinking about sort of this social justice kind of argument we're making, is that, I know that that the audience members I'm speaking with today know a great deal about both children and adults with disabilities. And we have, and you all know this already, but I'm just going to present briefly some data points to support what you already know. We know that both children and adults are disproportionately exposed to trauma in our society. There's good evidence to suggest that children with disabilities, for example, are at an increased risk of abuse and neglect. We know that adults with disabilities are at great risk of interpersonal violence. And unfortunately, we also know that most abuse is perpetrated by someone known to the victim. And so on the one hand, those are disturbing data points, particularly the fact that the people that perpetrate the harm are often the people that are tasked with caring for those individuals, or that are supposed to be their sources of care and compassion. The one silver lining potentially in that last data point is that because we know where most of the abuse emanates from, where it's most likely to occur or most likely to be located, we can also direct our attention to providing the kinds of supports and interventions within those contexts that may help to reduce the likelihood that both children and adults with disabilities will be exposed to trauma. So I am going to actually stop sharing there, and I'm going to turn it over to my friend and colleague, Dimitri, who's going to take us home. Dimitri, please.
Awesome, Josh. Thank you so much. While I am booting my slides up, is there one brief question that people would want to share with Josh? And please do batch your questions, record your questions so you can share them at the end. But is any question of Josh before we launch into the question about trauma effects? What are the effects or consequences or harm that trauma can inflict? Rachel, any questions out there for Josh for now?
I don't think so. I think you can continue.
Okay, we'll continue on. Josh, thank you so much for framing the issue so clearly for us. I will try to continue in that vein to identify what is the kind of the narrative that can help us understand the effects that trauma ultimately yields or renders. And these are somewhat universal and perhaps reliable effects. It doesn't mean that everybody who experiences trauma ultimately demonstrates or encounters these kinds of effects, these kinds of consequences. But it does mean that this is a possibility, particularly for those of us who encounter, as Josh described earlier, complex forms of childhood during sensitive periods of development. For instance, the adverse childhood experiences that Josh outlined for us. So what can happen in the aftermath of trauma exposure? Number one, we can remember the experience time and time and time again, either through basic cognitive thoughts about it, through emotions that are related to it, through sensations that are connected to it, et cetera, et cetera. And this remembering, sometimes referred to as intrusive thoughts or re-experiencing, can be uncontrollable and quite unpleasant. It can arise in the context of trauma reminders. I'm interfacing with a person, place, or thing that reminds me of the trauma experience. Or I'm minding my own business, and for reasons that we won't get into today, that experience, that memory may resurface without necessarily having a trauma cue stimulate that memory, that flashback, that intrusion, whatever we might call it. And many people will subjectively report that this is the worst kind of immediate after effect of trauma exposure because it's both unpleasant and uncontrollable, as I mentioned earlier, which can then lead to what we refer to as avoidance, officially called. And that can take many different forms. But because I'm trying to titrate or manage or control this experience of intrusive thoughts, kind of the flashbacks to the experience of trauma in various forms, I ultimately start to engage in coping skills that are avoidant in nature. I might consciously or effortfully avoid people, places, or things that remind me of the trauma exposure, which can be fine as long as it is conscious and it doesn't undermine my goal attainment. But when it becomes habitual and it undermines my avoidance to attain certain goals and visions that I have for myself, then it can start to ultimately impair my functioning. And that's when we get concerned about it. Avoidance can take other forms as well. Not only am I trying to avoid, for instance, external reminders of the experience of trauma exposure, but I might start to avoid internal reminders, internal memories, internal associations of that trauma experience. And I can do that by virtue of addictive or compulsive behaviors. And I can do that by virtue of kind of shutting off certain parts of my memory through repression or repression. In either case, if I do that at a conscious and somewhat limited or moderate level, it can be okay, maybe even adaptive. But if it takes on a life of its own, it can then devolve into addictive behaviors and ultimately can, again, undermine or impair my functioning. And a final immediate after effect of trauma exposure we refer to as hyperarousal, where I'm always on alert for threat, where my mind is scanning the environment for danger and for threat and is ready to respond to threat even where it doesn't exist. And this, again, can be adaptive and helpful if it's short term and keeps me safe, particularly in the immediate after effect or aftermath of trauma exposure. But it can become problematic when it becomes overgeneralized. I start to, in other words, interpret all experiences as traumatic in nature or potentially traumatic in nature, all context. And when it extends over a long period of time, it can really undermine my higher order cognitive functions. It tends to be a more kind of automatic and primitive part of the brain that detects and responds to trauma. And that takes energy from, or what's referred to as cognitive load from, the higher functionings in the brain, problem solving, perspective taking, etc. And all these processes can kind of take place or kind of occur somewhat automatically. They look differently in children versus adults, but nonetheless, they can really take root and ultimately lead to various problems. Let's start with mental health. So like Josh mentioned, they can lead to post-traumatic stress disorder if these problems persist over a long period of time, but they can lead to other mental health problems like depression. For instance, I'm continually thinking about myself as a victim or as vulnerable, and I'm thinking of other people as victimizers or as dangerous. That is not a necessarily very sort of salubrious or promotive mental stance to take day in and day out. And it can lead to a sense of myself as being really unworthy, a sense of the world as being problematic. It can lead to depression. If I have hyperarousal time and time and again, that can also devolve not just into agitation about the present moment, but it can lead to generalized anxiety disorder or even phobia, where I refuse to leave the house because I don't want to encounter trauma cues. There are other mental health problems that have been linked to trauma exposure, but just let's leave it at depression and anxiety as being two of the most prominent. There are behavioral health problems that have been linked to trauma exposure. Doesn't mean that if I experience trauma, I am certain to then develop an addictive behavior, a substance use related disorder, what have you, but I'm at heightened risk to do so if I've experienced complex trauma. Physical health problems, if I've experienced a lot of adversity and trauma in my life and I overinterpret threat and sort of activate my threat response system, fight, flight, freeze, or fear system, then that puts wear and tear on my organ system, that puts wear and tear on my body, that depresses my immune system and can lead to physical health problems later in life, as we know through the ACE studies that have been published now through a number of different research groups. And finally, trauma-related experiences, particularly in childhood, can result in later life employment problems. For obvious reasons, I have physical health problems, mental health problems, behavioral health problems, perhaps. Even my cognition is not as sharp as I would like it to be because I'm constantly engaged in this fight or flight kind of response, this fear response. Then that can really undermine my ability to do well in school, to do well at my workplace, even undermine my ability to experience a good social life. The data that we're showing here are from the FACT study, which Josh has led, as he mentioned, over the course of the last nearly 10 years now. These are data from earlier polls from the survey research that Josh and his team had conducted. And what these show is a typical patterned dose-response relationship between the number of different types of traumas I experienced as a child, adverse childhood experiences, which we're equating with traumas, the number of different types of traumas I've experienced as a child, and negative life outcomes over time. So, for instance, if I experience 0 ACEs, or if people in the study experience 0 ACEs, then their chances of having sort of poor physical health is actually much lower than, or if their chance of having good physical health is higher than if someone has 4 or more ACEs. These are scores from what's called the Global Physical Health Scale, and a score of 52.3 for 0 ACEs shows that someone actually has an above average health score, but a score of 46.8, 4 or more ACEs, suggests that someone has a lower than an average health score. So 0 ACEs, even in this sample of relatively low income adults, if I have 0 ACEs, I'm going to be doing I'm going to be doing okay with my health. But if I have 4 or more ACEs, not so okay. Same story with mental health. 0 ACEs with mental health correlates with a higher than average global mental health scale, whereas 4 or more ACEs correlates with a lower than average, well below average, actually, mental health score. Well, let's look when we're thinking about unwanted outcomes. Those are wanted outcomes, positive health and mental health. Now let's think about unwanted outcomes. The relationship between ACEs and anxiety. Now we see the more different types of ACEs that I endorse as an adult, the higher my probability of anxiety becomes, a positive anxiety screener. Same dose response, ladder-like relationship between my ACE score and my probability of experiencing depression. And same relationship, pattern relationship between my ACE score and my probability of having PTSD, positive PTSD screener. And same relationship between my ACE score and positive substance abuse disorder screener. Okay, well, that's great. We've come to 2:20, 10 minutes left. And we've talked about the problems that are associated with trauma, defined trauma, identified its prevalence, scope within our society. What can we do about it? Here's what we'll end here. We'll identify 2 different frameworks that can inform the ways we might work with people who are trauma affected. So the first framework discusses or identifies principles. The principles that might guide how I work with someone who's trauma affected include the following: safety, transparency, and trustworthiness, empowerment and choice, collaboration and mutuality, peer support, and cultural competence. Let's define those very briefly. What do we mean by safety? First and foremost, when I'm working with someone who's experienced significant adversity and trauma, particularly in childhood, I want to ensure that they're in a physically safe environment. That's what CPS is all about. That's what Adult Protective Services is all about, first and foremost, to ensure that the people that we're serving are safe in their home, safe in the community. But secondly, and perhaps as if not more important, we want to ensure that they're developing a sense of psychological safety. So the services that I'm providing are, first and foremost, they're structured, they're reliable. I'm a reliable service provider. I'm a reliable caregiver, respite caregiver, whatever it might be. I do what I say I'm going to do, and I do it predictably. I provide structure for the people with whom I'm serving. And also, moving to that second point, I'm very transparent about what I'm doing. I'm communicating what I'm doing. And by virtue of doing that and being reliable, I become a trustworthy actor, which will help ultimately reverse engineer the effects of these children engaging with untrustworthy actors over the course of their childhood. But that takes time. I also provide a lot of choice when I'm engaging with people who are trauma affected. The hallmark of trauma is loss of control and choice. And so to reverse engineer its effects, I want to provide choice when I can, within certain limits. And that will help to empower someone. I validate someone's experience. That can also help to empower someone. I don't necessarily, that doesn't mean that I have to validate or reinforce bad behavior, but I can understand where that behavior comes from. I can support someone in their feelings and their experience, but I will put limits around their behaviors. The two are not mutually exclusive. And finally, another point I'll make is that when I'm working with those who are trauma affected, I'm very aware of their social connections. To the extent that I can, I try to enhance their connections with other peers through various means, whether it might be peer support groups, etc. Because we know that social connections is the #1 predictor of recovery from trauma. Oftentimes, social connections is the first outcome that ultimately can be impaired by virtue of trauma exposure, isolation, loss of self-esteem, as Josh mentioned earlier. But then a reconnection with others can be one way to help people recover from trauma. So these trauma-informed principles can be helpful to think how to operationalize them, but it can also be really helpful to translate them into concrete, actual practical trauma responsive practices. And this is something that Josh and I have thought a lot about. How do we actually translate trauma-informed principles into trauma responsive practices? It's something that the field has thought a lot about. I'll review these very briefly. You should have I believe that we circulated a trauma responsive issue brief that Josh authored and I helped with. And it outlines 5 different forms of trauma responsive practice. #1, screening and assessment. When I'm working in a formal social, human, or medical service, healthcare service system, I really want to consider whether or not I can and should screen for and assess for trauma exposure and trauma symptoms, as well as those assets or those resources that can help me recover from trauma. Josh and I argue very strongly that assessing for trauma exposure, trauma symptoms, and the resources that can help one recover from trauma is a really great first step in addressing the problem, particularly in formal settings. Secondly, I provide information about trauma when I'm working with trauma-affected people. What is that information? Well, #1, what is trauma? What are some examples of it? What's the definition? What are examples? How does it affect me, and how can I recover from it? I believe also we circulated a understanding and responding to trauma fact sheet that we've developed that identifies those 4 very categories, or answers those 4 very questions. What is trauma? What are some examples of it? How does it affect me? How can I recover from it? Thirdly, we help people focus on coping, strengthening their coping skills, because coping skills are oftentimes one of the first targets of trauma exposure. The first victims of trauma exposure are my coping skills. What kinds of coping skills? How can I maintain a sense of calm instead of always becoming hyper aroused or hyper vigilant in the face of social interactions, for instance? How can I maintain a sense of calm so that I can appraise situations correctly? Yeah, this situation is potentially dangerous. I should be careful. This situation is not potentially dangerous. I should enjoy it. So how can I maintain a sense of calm? How can I enhance my social and communication skills? I talked about that a little bit earlier. reconnect with others, but also strengthen my social skills, because these are some of the first coping skills that will be the target of trauma experiences, potential traumatic experiences. Also, as a provider, social service provider, I want to focus very consciously, mindfully, and intentionally on building a very positive relationship with those that I'm serving. I may use, for instance, motivational interviewing practices and skills because it does a great job of being very client-centered, client-focused, and building positive rapport between providers and recipients of various services. And finally, I provide my services within a rich network of community collaborators or community partners, so that I can refer out when I need to for various supports that people may need. And the one reason that I may need to do that with trauma-affected clients, trauma-affected adults or children, as Josh mentioned, is because trauma can have negative or deleterious effects in any one of a number of domains. And so I want to have a number of different service providers that can help address those domains that might have been affected, like, for instance, mental health, physical health, parenting, behavioral health, housing, employment, et cetera, et cetera. I'm not going to talk about trauma response focused services, other than to say that these are formal clinical services that are provided by licensed mental health or behavioral health professionals. These are the people to whom we may refer trauma-affected clients. And the good news is that these types of services have become more and more effective over the course of the last, say, 10, 20, 30 years. And we have really great technology now to be able to deliver these good services in a way that can be very helpful to trauma-affected individuals. And so the news is good. I would say that this is a good time to be working in the trauma-informed and trauma-responsive context. Oh boy, let me stop there and open it up to question and answers. Perhaps we have a little bit more than just a minute left, but perhaps we just have a minute left. But if there are any questions, Rachel, Josh and I would love to field them.
Yeah, Rachel, does this session go until 2:45 or 2:30?
Yes, 2:45.
Oh, fantastic.
Okay, good.
Oh, fantastic. Very good.
So, my question is there a assessment that you can recommend for people like us in the service world, just to get something basic going? So, because a lot of times, we can say we have a concern, but it's so much better if we can say, look, I did this assessment. You can see it, and it's not just what I'm thinking.
Absolutely. So, I mean, I can respond to that, and then I'll defer to Josh. There are many assessments that have been developed to help us understand both of these questions. So, what has someone experienced that may be potentially traumatic in nature, and how has that affected them? Particularly when using a PTSD lens, although there are other ways to think about obviously the effects of trauma exposure, as Josh discussed. So we use a number of different tools to better understand the exposure question. Josh and I developed with Josh's leadership an adverse childhood experience tool or instrument assessment called the Childhood Experiences Survey, which assesses for those 10 common adverse childhood experiences, 5 forms of physical abuse and neglect, and 5 forms of sort of household challenges or dysfunctions, as people sometimes refer to it. But we also added a number of items, I believe 8 additional items to assess for other experiences that particularly children living in low-income neighborhoods or families may commonly experience. Like, for instance, exposure to community violence, exposure to homelessness, exposure to poverty in the household, exposure to bullying outside the household, etc. Josh has led a number of studies on that instrument, and it's been shown to be both reliable and valid. And it's pretty user-friendly, and it's free of charge and freely available. It's open source. So that's and I'll defer to Josh. He can talk more about that instrument and others. There are other instruments that assesses just for childhood exposure. There are other instruments that assess for lifetime exposure. We also use an instrument called the trauma history screen that's been validated particularly in medical settings, primary care settings. And what's nice about that tool is it assesses for lifetime exposure, as I mentioned, but it also assesses not just for potential traumatic events that might fall under that first American Psychiatric Association definition that Josh shared, but it also assesses for those types of events that would fall under that second definition, that SAMHSA definition, Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration definition. So we like instruments that capture trauma, not just in its really kind of narrow form, but also in its broader form. So those are some exposure instruments. And then there are some symptom instruments that are really excellent. Josh,
The name of assessments and where they can be found, just so some people can jot those down.
Sure, Joshua, do you want to take? I'll write something in the chat. Perhaps that would be useful. And Josh, you could.
I think yeah, if you want, you can just post a link, Dimitri, to the assessment portion of our of the ICSW page.
Yes.
That would get them started, I think. So just to piggyback briefly on what Dimitri was saying, there's no shortage of tools that are available. Some of which we've developed. There are many others out there, though. Another one, for example, is what's called the life events checklist, right? Where sort of you can ask people questions about certain events that happen at different points in their life course. I did want to, I guess, offer since we're lacking a lot of the context around the question that we would need to really answer it deeply. I guess I just want to offer a couple of cautions in that regard. Number one, I think if you were going to implement some kind of a screening tool for trauma, I think you'd probably want to do so systematically. In other words, it probably something you would want to do as an agency or organization in a universal sort of systematic way, as opposed to something that's just sort of like willy-nilly. Secondly, I think it's really important that if you're going to ask the questions, that you have protocols that follow the questions, right? So you don't just ask the questions and then that's the end of the story. You either have to have some kind of like protocols in place to have a conversation about the questions, and or have some means of referring individuals or families to other kinds of supports or services that may address some of the concerns that arise within the context of a screening or assessment. And lastly, I would just suggest sort of relatedly that if you're going to do it, I tend to, this is my bias, but I tend to favor assessments that, particularly if they're initial, that are pretty brief. So using brief screens or brief assessments is probably, you're better off than using a really, really long instrument. But just some thoughts.
It's excellent. And to Josh's point, we have developed a protocol to help people administer trauma exposure and trauma symptom screenings. So we refer to it as the trauma screening, brief intervention, and referral to treatment protocol. I've dropped a link in the chat that people can access and then check out that TSPRT protocol. It integrates those 5 trauma responsive practices that we identified. It also it's based on, for instance, it's based on motivational interviewing principles. It integrates the trauma informed principles that we discussed. And ultimately, to Josh's very point, it provides some nice guidance and guidelines around how to ask these questions, and then ultimately how to respond to people's answers in such a way that, 1, we do no harm, and 2, we can really take advantage of the process of learning about someone's experience of trauma exposure and trauma symptoms. We can deepen our rapport with somebody. We can deepen our insight into someone's experience, and we can enrich our plan of action in working with that person. So we highly recommend assessing for trauma exposure and potentially even trauma reactions. It's nice to call them trauma reactions in a non-clinical context. We're not referring to them as trauma symptoms necessarily. There's a nice trauma symptom screener that is referred to as the primary care post-traumatic stress disorder screener that we use. To Josh's point, it's very brief, it's freely available, it's freeware, and we integrate that into the T-SBIRT protocol. But we don't refer to the questions as symptom-related questions. Instead, they're ultimately just exploring natural trauma reactions because we're not using it diagnostically. In any case, this protocol can really help us ask the questions using best interview practice, respond to people's answers using best interview practice, and ultimately kind of produce the best outcomes, the cherished and hoped for outcomes in having this conversation. I deepen my rapport with somebody. I strengthen the trust that they have in me, that I'm reliable, that I'm trustworthy, that I can handle the challenges that they're sharing with me. And I actually am able to use the information to enrich my interactions with that person, whether it be my service plan or my general approach as a respite caregiver, foster parent, whatever it might be. So we've provided those links. Feel free to check those out. And that's a great question.
We're just wrapping up. We have we have time for one more question. Help me.
Trying to put this motion together.
Okay.
I guess
One last question. That's what I was trying to say. Wow.
I guess what I wanted to know more about was, have you found through these surveys or through this data that you've collected that having more trauma experiences may lead to care avoidance? Well, we were talking just earlier, like what prevents us from getting to the people who need it, or what prevents them from self-identifying. And so I wanted to know if the presence of complex trauma or any traumas may affect their willingness to identify the need for care, or their avoidance of a particular type of care services.
I have it's a great question. I have two data points and then kind of just two empirical answers to that question and a conceptual answer to that question. And then I'll hand it over to Josh. That is a great question. Can you identify yourself who asked that question? What's your name?
Someone living with trauma.
Oh,
I'm a care provider. I provide respite care, but I am also a family caregiver.
understood. I just asked you your first name, but just to be just to kind of be more personable. It's because I can't see you, but I appreciate the question. It's a wonderful one.
Phone number.
Thank you.
Phone number.
Got it. Thank you. So the data points that I would identify, and Josh may have others. There are two. One, people who've experienced a good deal of adversity and trauma, say these complex experiences of trauma in childhood, like adverse childhood experiences, when they answer the childhood experiences survey, and this comes from data that we've collected through the FACT study, Josh has collected through the FACT study, when they answer the childhood experiences survey, they're more distressed, they're more agitated, they're more activated. So they might be experiencing hyperarousal. This might be a trauma trigger that having this conversation alone, and it might ultimately lead to withdrawal, avoidance, because that is a common reaction to kind of re-experiencing, to being triggered, in other words. So absolutely, and so that data point suggests that greater sense of distress may lead to a little bit of avoidance, or a great deal of avoidance of care provision. But here's what's interesting. We have some data from T-SBIRT studies, from our trauma screening, brief intervention, referral to treatment studies, to suggest that those people who've experienced more adversity and trauma in their lives are actually more interested or more willing to seek help after they have this conversation. So if I'm able to have a really good conversation with somebody using my best practice interview skills, best practice relational skills, then the data suggests that might help somebody overcome their natural reaction of avoidance, their natural experience of distress to addressing these issues. There's no question conceptually, and I guess from other research that's been published. There's no question that greater experiences, cumulative experiences of trauma exposure, is going to potentially lead to a greater likelihood of avoidance of help-seeking behavior. But so there's the answer to your question, I think, is a resounding yes. But there's the good news is that with, I think, helpful best practice services, we can help people overcome their avoidance tendencies. Joshua, how would you respond to that?
Yeah, just a couple quick follow-ups. I mean, number one, Dimitri's right. People, when you ask them questions about trauma, some proportion are going to experience some level of distress. A very, very small proportion will report significant distress. Most people can handle those questions well, and as Dimitri suggested, within the context of a caring relationship, with a good relationship with a care provider, it's very rare for simply asking those questions to cause significant harm. If anything, it's more likely to lead to positive effects. And then secondly, just sort of going back to what we talked about PTSD earlier, going back to what we know from, populations that have PTSD, it's well established that PTSD symptoms, for example, a hallmark symptom of it is avoidance, right? And we know that a lot of times help-seeking rates are low, and even after they seek help, dropout rates from treatment or services is high. So yeah, just to reinforce what Dimitri said in the gist of your question, I think the answer is yes.
Thank you so much.
It was a great question.
Yeah, great
I
question.
just wanted to, for the future, is medical trauma ever considered as a part of these assessments? Like people who have experienced medical trauma or trauma while receiving medical care?
Again, such a great question. There are other kinds of instruments, not ones that we've developed or that we typically use. We typically focus more so on quote unquote psychological forms of trauma, although there are, like, we did develop another instrument called the Adult Experiences Survey that includes things like, say, having a miscarriage, which isn't exactly what you asked about. But in any event, there are other kinds of tools that ask about birth trauma, for example, or other forms of trauma. So again, it just sort of gets back to what we talked about earlier, that there's such a wide variety of different ways that trauma can manifest that no one tool or instrument can capture them all. So if it's relevant to your area of practice to capture medical forms of trauma, then I would either try to seek out a tool, and you can certainly contact us, and we'll be happy to point you in the right direction. And if there isn't something, then make up your own questions, right? And get the information you want. I don't know, Dimitri, if you had anything to chime in.
No, that's great. Other than to say that there's been, I think, some pretty good research to suggest that, particularly amongst children, medical trauma can really have a long-lasting effect, and could really be considered at some point another type of ACE, adverse childhood experience. Great question.
Thank you very much. Gotcha.
It's been our pleasure. Thank you for having us. I wish we could be there in person.
We appreciate your time and expertise. Thank you so much.
Oh, of course, anytime.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
I'm waiting too.